Oh, welcome. My name is Bob Barker, Managing Partner at Barker Gilmore, and thank you for joining today's GC Advantage webinar. Today's topic is creating an effective onboarding plan for senior legal leaders. And this information will be helpful for those, whether you're brought in from outside the organization or you're being promoted internally within the organization. As far as today's webinar, it's part of our GC Advantage program. And this is a complimentary program that we've developed, and it's content and experience and knowledge that's been put together by really all the different members of our team. Today's is from both Michelle as well as Sherry that you'll meet in a few minutes. But it's just a culmination of our resources and experience to help companies recruit, develop their talent, succession planning, optimizing legal and compliance departments, and what have you. We have the webinar that's going to be coming up next month in January is about diversity, and it's becoming a champion for diversity. And it's a conversation with Bruce Jackson, who's had just an amazing life experience, and he's looking forward to having a candid discussion with my partner, John Gilmore, on suggestions for how companies can better achieve diversity initiatives. And for the first 500 people that attend, we are going to be offering complimentary copies of his book, Never Far From Home. Today's presentation and slides are going to be recorded. They're going to be made available on our on-demand library in about 3 weeks. And an email will be sent to everyone who's participating today once that material is available. Throughout the course of this webinar, we encourage you to submit questions. There's a Q&A icon on the Zoom application, and you'll also be able to see questions which have already been submitted. And if you like a question, it's got the same question. Essentially, you can just click should be a thumbs up icon, and then we'll know that this is a very popular question, and we'll address those quickest. And we'll do our best to answer as many questions during, by the end of today's session. Well, I'm pleased to introduce Michelle Banks. Michelle's today's host, and she's senior advisor at Barker Gilmore, as former EVP and Global General Counsel, Corporate Secretary, and Chief Compliance Officer for GAT. Michelle, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll be back near the end of today's session.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome, everyone. Bob, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound crystal clear to me.
Okay, terrific. I wanted to make sure. It's my pleasure to lead this program today, and we would like to invite you, if you're listening live, to participate. So as Bob mentioned, feel free to submit a question using the Q&A function. And if you submit a question, we won't answer it immediately, but I do assure you that my goal is to leave 15 minutes at the end of today to make sure that we answer as many questions as possible. So I want to welcome and thank my friend Cherie Johnson, who is the Chief Legal Officer of Dentsply Sirona, for joining me today. I'm going to start out by giving about a 10-minute, no more than 10-minute introduction of the concept of onboarding and onboarding plans. But then I'm going to engage in a conversation with Cherie for about another 15 minutes or so. And then we want to be sure that we answer your questions and speak about the topics that are of most interest to you. So with that agenda in mind, let's talk about onboarding and lay a little bit of the foundation for the rest of today's conversation. So apparently the word onboarding came into existence in the 70s. It became a more common business term in about the last 20 years. And I believe it came from the concept of stepping on board a vehicle and moving forward. So a well-structured onboarding plan is something that makes you, as a new employee or as a new leader, or in the concept of helping a new leader, move along faster and more quickly, hence onboarding. So really, this is the process of assimilating new hires or new leaders into a company or within a company if you're a new promote. The most common strategy for the onboarding process is two things: a new employee orientation if the employee is new to the company, and even if the employee is not new to the company, to come up with an onboarding plan. What's an onboarding plan? It sounds like jargon, but it really just means a guide to help the person adjust and become assimilated quickly and successfully to a new role. The plan should be a roadmap that includes key information such as resources, relationships, and activities that the person should engage in. And ideally, it will have some milestones. And the kinds of things that will be in an onboarding plan are readings, meetings, trainings, maybe trips, tours. It depends on the company and the company's business and what the focus of the organization is and what the person's role is, of course. But really, again, this is welcome on board, and we want to help set you up for success. Onboarding does look a little different, as I said, if you're new to a company or you're newly promoted within a company. But really the big difference there is, do you need to go through some kind of a new employee orientation, whether that's a day or a week of a process? What I want to talk about is some of the things that aren't obvious or less obvious, or some of the lessons learned that Cherie and I have encountered in the course of onboarding to new roles and new companies. But just to finish the introductory concept, there's a lot of talk about how long the onboarding process should be. Some of you might have seen there's a book out that's quite popular called The First 90 Days. But there are best practice companies that will make an onboarding plan for as comprehensive and robust as the entire first year in a new job. So I would say that onboarding plans are anywhere from 3 months to 12 months. You'll see the 3-month plan, the 6-month plan, the 9-month plan, the 12-month plan. I don't personally think there's one right way and any wrong ways. I think what's standard at your company and works for you may be different based on the circumstances and the situation. I guess what I would say is I would strongly encourage you to focus on onboarding as a process and a best practice and to have some type of plan, but I don't feel strongly that 90 days or 1 year are the right answer. The other thing I would say is ideally onboarding is a collaborative process. And what I mean by that is you as the manager or you as the new employee or the new promote should participate. But ideally also someone from your people or human resources team would be involved as well. And ideally they would bring some best practices and some company structure to the process. But what I really want to encourage you on is if you don't work at a large company or you don't work at a company with these type of people or HR resources, do it anyway. Do your own onboarding plan or partner with your manager to create an onboarding plan. I think it will really help you be more effective. In fact, there has been some research done that has shown that the more senior your role, the longer it takes to successfully and effectively onboard into that role. So if you want to hit the ground running and be more effective more quickly, you will give this some thought. And you'll partner ideally with your manager and your people team to do what fits best with the role and the expectations for it, as well as the culture and other dynamics at the company. So one more statistic I wanted to mention is that according to the Harvard Business Review, 50% or more than 50%, 57% of senior executives found fitting in socially to be one of their biggest challenges in a new role at a company. So I think it's really helpful if you think about starting the onboarding process before you even start at the company. Ideally, it may not always happen. Some of us don't have any breaks when we start a new position. But if you have a break, if there's some time before you start, I strongly encourage you to at least socially meet and greet, even if it's virtual, before you start. There's something to be said for just putting some names with faces and introducing yourself to some folks. I think that it's really important as the leader who's creating the onboarding plan, if that's you, or if you manage that leader, to think about not just making a checklist. Checklists are good. You know, ideally you have a list, if not a checklist, if not a spreadsheet, but putting some context around things. So if you ask someone to meet someone, or you ask someone to attend a training, it's helpful if you give them why. Why are they meeting that person? What do you hope might come out of that meeting? What do you hope one of the topics of discussion might be? You don't have to do all the work for the person, but any hints and tricks and tips you would give them would help them, again, get on board quicker, be more successful, and make the transition more smooth. Onboarding is really just a time of transition, and you're trying to make it as easy and effective as possible. Some key pillars of onboarding plans that you'll see when you read about this, if you read some of the human resources literature: understanding the company's business, understanding the company's culture, taking charge of a team if you will lead one, and aligning with your stakeholders. And I would really encourage you to think about your stakeholders both internally and externally. Internally to your team, externally to the company. Internally to the company, externally to the industry, or to what other important stakeholders, depending on the role. We are consultants, so of course I have to mention that hiring a coach can be a helpful part to an aspect of facilitating the onboarding process, but it's not necessary. And if you don't have the budget to do that, that is completely understandable. And you can get help from mentors, from managers, from peers, and from others. I think the important thing to do is to have somebody help you understand the culture of the company if you're walking into a new company, or the culture of the C-suite if it's your first time there. You need to understand what are some of the people dynamics, what are some of the norms of the company, and importantly, how are decisions being made at the company or at the level that you may be new to, or that you may be helping a new employee. So let me just mention a few things that I think are important that I've sort of mentioned, but I want to mention them in more of a list format. A comprehensive onboarding plan will include introductions, visits, meetings with key people. Trainings or immersive experiences in areas that the new person is unfamiliar with. Events to attend, tours to take, and trips to make, hopefully, if you have any budget for that. I want to stop talking and introduce my friend and colleague and a current Chief Legal Officer who we mentioned at the beginning, Cherie Johnson. Cherie, I am thrilled, is joining us today to talk about onboarding because she's had some unique onboarding experience. Cherie has extensive experience as a Deputy General Counsel and a General Counsel, making transitions herself and onboarding members of her teams at several companies. So as Bob mentioned, Cherie is currently the Chief Legal Officer of a public company, Dentsply Sirona, and she has been with that company since February of this year. Last year, Cherie was a first-time General Counsel at another large company, W.R. Grace. Grace was a public company, and late last year, it was taken private and became a part of Standard Industries, and that's why Cherie made that transition. Before becoming a General Counsel, Cherie served as a Deputy General Counsel at several major companies, including Cargill, Heinz, and McCormick & Company. So with that, I want to welcome Cherie and invite her to say hello to you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you and partnering with Barker Gilmore for this, which I think was going to be, it's quite helpful, this discussion that we're going to have. So thank you.
Great. So let's start our conversation. I have a few prepared questions for you, and then we will get some help from the team to see what the audience would like to talk about. So starting from the beginning, Cherie, who created your new employee onboarding plans or your new promoted employee onboarding plans when you were a deputy general counsel and then a general counsel? Did you do it yourself? Did someone do it for you? And approximately how long were they? What is your experience?
Sure. So I'll just highlight just a couple of experiences that I think could be quite helpful. So when I was at McCormick, it was a combination of myself as well as HR playing a role and my manager playing a role in what the onboarding plan looked like. Because as I started the organization, I morphed into a more significant role, the Deputy General Counsel role. So there wasn't a formal onboarding plan just because there wasn't a formal break in the work that I was doing. So I worked with my manager to create a 6-month plan of what I wanted to accomplish in my new role. It was a little bit different when I went to W.R. Grace. That was my first time becoming a general counsel. And that work in terms of the onboarding was a compilation of HR, the business unit leaders had a say so, but one individual who really steered the direction was the CEO. And I think that was quite helpful because it was clear what the CEO wanted and making sure that that plan was going to achieve his goals, but also make me successful. And that was about a 6-month plan as well. And then when I joined this company, Dentsply Sirona, the onboarding plan was mostly driven by the HR team, but I also had a lot of requests and questions just from my experiences that I've had and time working with you, Michelle, of some of the information and things that I wanted to see as a part of the onboarding plan. So although I had not been yet an employee, I still played a role in crafting that onboarding plan. And that plan was about a year, but we have about 3-month or 90-day check-ins. So I have milestones built in there as well.
I love that. So you're basically validating my experience, which I think 6 months might be the most common, just now having worked with about 25 companies. I think 6 months might be the most common. While you'll see as short as 90 days and as long as a year, I feel like the first 6 months is typical.
Yes.
Your experiences seem typical to me as well. Sometimes you have to drive it. Sometimes the manager drives it. Sometimes HR drives it. There's no one answer.
Right.
And I like the idea that you are doing check-ins, and I want to talk more about that. You anticipated one of my later questions, but let's just talk about it now. So what I like to tell people is, if your manager does those check-ins regularly, great. But if your manager doesn't, I like to say, you want to have alignment meetings. You want to make sure you're meeting expectations. You also want to toot your own horn a little bit, share some of your accomplishments, your successes, and also adjust. So give me a sense, Cherie, if you come up with a 6-month plan, how often does it shift or adjust, or what's your experience as far as, does everyone sort of anticipate up front, or how much does it change over the 6 months or longer?
Sure. So what I've done over time as I've worked on my onboarding plans, I've actually built in the check-ins. And not only does that keep me honest and keep it on top of mind for me, but as I'm sharing my onboarding plan, because I think that's another key component, sharing the onboarding plan with your constituents. And in that case, would be your boss, the CEO, in my case, my peers, so the business unit leaders, as well as other critical members of the team. Hey, this is the onboarding plan. I'm going to be checking in with you to make sure that I'm delivering what I need to deliver for you and the team. And I'm communicating in a way that's open and transparent. So with the CEO, for example, I started off wanting to meet every week, and I'm just kind of getting a feel for, his availability, mine, his temperament, things that are going on. And over time, we settled in on what that check-in cadence is going to be. And it really has been different for some of the other stakeholders. But the key for me was really building that into the plan so that we all are very clear on how often we should be connecting. And if it's too much or too little, we have to just be able to adjust. So we have a plan as a starting point, but being able to modify that plan as we go is critical.
Agreed. One of the things that I have seen is that if a individual creates their own plan, they're thinking about it from the perspective of a lawyer leader.
Yeah.
But if a HR department or a people representative is creating the onboarding plan, they are thinking about it from a new employee perspective or a leadership perspective, but they don't necessarily know the nuances of what should a chief compliance officer or a associate general counsel be thinking about. So I wanted to give some examples of what might be some of the things that if you receive an onboarding plan as a new employee or as a newly promoted employee, what might some things be? And so I'll give a few examples. What I suggest is that if there is a onboarding program or some materials for your board of directors, particularly if you're going to be the corporate secretary or the assistant corporate secretary or a corporate lawyer, but in general, I think it would be helpful to most lawyer leaders that you ask to see a copy of and you read or experience what new directors to your company will experience. And that's not necessarily something that I have found that the HR department, they might not even know that exists or have familiarity with it. The other thing is risk assessments. So different parts of the company may conduct risk assessments. Your own compliance team might do it, but it also might be done by the internal audit team or some other team that may not report to you. And I think if you are in a general counsel or a compliance role, or even a senior leader or compliance or ethics role, you're going to want to see those risk assessments. The last one I'll mention, Cherie, and then I would love to hear what you think might be some of the missing things if somebody who doesn't know your function or your expertise very well. Shareholder lists. So especially if it's a public company, I would ask investor relations for, top 10 shareholders, top 20 shareholders. Companies have different ways they look and slice and dice their shareholders, but probably there is a list of key players that, again, if you ask the finance department to onboard you, they might think of, but if the people team is doing it, they might not think of. So what are some other things or some other ways that you think about onboarding and other things or documents that you would want to get a hold of?
Yes. So all of those I've asked for, and those have been invaluable. The other, thinking about this from the lenses, so to your point, you have the board lens, you have the finance lens, you have the HR lens. I also like to think of my onboarding from the commercial lens as well. So not only do I sit down with my peers and say, hey, look, imagine if I were a new sales leader, what information do I need to know about the company? Tell me how you're presenting yourselves to the company. So that may be sales materials, that may be presentations that they've given. I like to sit down with the strategy person. Tell me where you see this company going. What's on the horizon? And then finally, what I love to do as well is sit with the individual sales folks and go on sales calls with them. I also want to see how the organization is being presented to customers. What do the customers see when they look at this organization? There may be a trade show that may be coming up that I'll be able to, join the sales team. And so being able to look at the organization from all of the different vantage points and read up as much as I can really helps me to prepare. And then finally, what I've done in the past, which has been incredibly helpful, is I sit down with one or two of our key outside counsel and say, okay, tell me not only some of the open cases that you're working on, But if I were the other side, how would I be thinking about this organization? Tell me about the litigation strategy. Tell me about the IP strategy. Tell me about the acquisition strategy, so on. So to your point, looking at the organization from the various lenses, not just the legal seat, but the various lenses really gives me a fulsome enough picture. Now, of course, it raises a ton more questions, but I take those questions, and when I go back to my stakeholders and my peers, I'm able to ask a little bit more educated questions because I have a little bit more insight into the company.
I love that. A few of those I have had on my list, but I have to tell you, the sales training one is not something I've had on my list, and I love that. And I love the customer lens thinking. And that actually leads very well into my next question, and we didn't plan that. What are the things that you think about doing first? So, in a year-long or a 6-month or even a 90-day onboarding plan, there might be 100 items, 20 items. It depends on, what it is and how robust it is. But what are one of the two things that you think about making sure you do, the first week or early on? And I'll give my example, and it has to do with your point about customers. So one of the things that I think is super important for a new in-house lawyer is to understand how you should refer to your customers, your clients, your business partners. Do you call them partners? Do you call them clients? Do you call them customers? Because it can really rub people the wrong way. Something as simple as you refer to them differently how everyone else refers to them, especially if you come from a company, for example, that calls their business clients, for example. And at your new company, they call them partners. And maybe client is offensive because somebody feels like they should be called a partner. I mean, I'm making this up and this is simplistic, but I think learning the terminology and simple things like how to refer to people and how to introduce people and how to communicate with people is important. What are some of the other things that you will think about, like in the first week?
Yes. So I think in terms of lists, because I'm between you and I and the rest of the group, I'm a little anal. So over the years, I've bucketed things, and I have a couple buckets. And so those buckets in terms of, so as I'm experiencing the company in the variety of different ways and I'm gathering information, I try to put them in these buckets. So the buckets are, number one, business orientation. Is that kind of giving me information about the business, the history, the sales, so on and so forth. Stakeholder connections. Who are those important people, companies, partners, vendors, third parties to that company? Then there's a cultural adaptation. Are these questions about the culture? What should I know about what's happening within the organization? Unwritten rules, politics within the company. Then there's leadership engagement. So who are the leaders? Sometimes the leaders may not have the titles. Sometimes the titles may not indicate who are actually the leaders. And how do they like to interact with one another? And then there's management and governance, which has to do with the management team, but more so has to do with the board. How is the board engaging with the company? How does the company like to engage with the board and the CEO and so forth? And then in the final bucket is expectations of every one of those stakeholders. And all of those are big, heavy, weighty situations. And by the way, expectations, it's also, are there things that are going on in the company that are urgent in nature? Is the company getting ready to have a significant acquisition or a major litigation or whatever? And you need to manage those expectations. And so what I would do in my first week, my first couple days, I would sit down with the CEO, with the CHRO, and any other key stakeholder, but primarily those two individuals, and say, I have information and question on each one of these buckets. From your perspective, in the next 15 days, 30 days, month, 2 months, or however long that they think it should be, what are your priorities for me? What are those things that you believe are burning platforms that may or may not be on this onboarding list, but that you want me to focus on? It's either going to be a specific item or it's going to be one of these specific buckets. On my prior companies, the senior leader has said, look, it's really, really important because of the history of who we've had here in the past, that you understand the cultural adaptation. You understand what it means to work at this company, how we interact with each other, how we make decisions. For other companies, it's really just been, look, we need you to manage the board. The board is very new. We have a lot going on. We need you to be the sole focus. Your sole focus for the next couple weeks needs to be the board. And so that really gives me an idea of how to prioritize what needs to happen in those first 90 days or what have you. And it also gives me some insight into how I would ask my questions, into whom I would ask my questions. Because we all have long lists of people that we need to meet and plant visits we need to take and this issue and this litigation, but it really helps to put things into perspective, especially when other individuals believe that they are a priority as well, and they may not have made your list. So it really helps to make sure everyone is aligned and everyone's clear, and you can communicate clearly what it is you're going to be working on first, second, third, or 100th.
I like that. I really like that you have such an organized and strategic way of thinking about it. So thank you for sharing your 5 buckets with us. And I really enjoyed and appreciate you mentioning the unwritten rules, because I think that if you are the manager or if you are helping someone onboard to a company, I think that one of the most useful things you could do is what I mentioned, help them understand how decisions get made. And what you mentioned, help them understand the unwritten rules. And one of the things I like to tell people is that those things may come, in your case, Cherie, from people like the CHRO and the CEO. But if a lawyer is a more junior lawyer or is just newer to the company and doesn't have access to those 2 individuals, there's a lot of information that you can learn about unwritten rules in a company culture, or how decisions are made, or how to have influence at a company. And one of the things I like to tell people is your assistant, if you have one, or the CEO's assistant, may have the best knowledge of things like the unwritten rules and where is the power, the real power, as you said, not necessarily titles, but
Yes.
how do you get things done at your company? And some people that may not be obvious, maybe the people who have some of the best tips in that area. I always encourage my friends and clients, if they are going to a new company and they will have an assistant, get to know that person first and have that person share information with you, ideally before you even start. So now I'd love to talk. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, oftentimes they may even know where the bodies are buried, right? And so really,
I almost said that, but yes. I was hesitant. So I love that you're saying that.
Yes, yes. So just leveraging that individual, because they would normally have the longevity as well to know who's who.
So I want to ask a question that goes to sharing kind of lessons learned. So mine is that when I was preparing for this program, it occurred to me that I've created a lot of onboarding plans in my, 30 years in business. And I have never added anything around health, wellness, self-care. I've never thought about the person as a person, frankly. I've always been so business focused. So I'm curious, Cherie, you are a real health advocate. Have you ever literally written into someone's plan or written into your own plan anything around health, wellness, self-care, avoiding burnout, anything like that for making a transition?
Yes. So in the past, I would have that on my own personal onboarding. So I had the corporate one and then me personally. And what I would try to do before I start any job, it was very important to me to spend at least a day, sometimes 2 or 3 days at the spa. Not just the day before, but also after that first week. And then what I started to do for employees, where I would onboard, and even in subsequent onboarding plans, I wouldn't do the spa thing explicitly, but I would have walking meetings. In walking meetings, it sounds pretty simple, but it gives you an opportunity to get to know someone. You're kind of, you're distracted, you're walking, sometimes you can know if they walk fast or speak fast or walk slow or what have you, but you almost form a little bit more of a deeper relationship than just a in-person sitting down or a video. And so that achieves the health and wellness piece. You also get to know them, and you also become pretty vulnerable. Some of you all may not know I'm not as tall as I would like to be. And so oftentimes when I'm in these walking meetings, I really have to look, I need you to slow down. My legs are not that long. And it kind of breaks the tension a little bit. So I enjoy I enjoy walking meetings, and I try to build those in as an indirect way of, having time to, just kind of decompress and self-care. But I try to build in meditation throughout the week and throughout the day. And that in the spa before and after is really important. So really just having an opportunity to just mentally decompress. The other thing that I do also recommend with my onboarding plans, particularly for the first month, I encourage my teams to block their calendars for Monday mornings and Friday afternoons, and really just a time to be able to start your week and kind of plan your week and get things rolling. And then at the end of the week, time to breathe and figure out, okay, what is it that you learned that week? What do you need to think about for the weekend or what have you? But really encourage them to block off the Monday morning and Friday afternoons so that they have that time to breathe and take in what they've learned and prepare for the next week.
That's great. I love that advice. Between breathing, walking, meditating, and spying, people should be in great shape. If you could actually even do one or two of those, that would probably be terrific with how busy most lawyers are. I love that. Thank you for the inspiration. So we do have questions. I see there are questions in the audience. So I want to make sure that we leave a lot of time to talk about the topics that people are most interested in. So let me end my questions for you by saying, do you have any lessons learned or tips that are not specific to onboarding or plans? In fact, you kind of started on this, which is just a time management tool that you mentioned, which is blocking Monday mornings and Friday afternoons. I used to do the Friday afternoons. I have to admit that I didn't do the Monday morning, so I usually ended up working Sunday nights. But I did do the Friday afternoons, and that worked terrifically.
Yes.
So do you have any other tips, just, in general? They could be about onboarding or transitioning or planning, but they might just be in general. My tip that I want to mention is ask for feedback. Ask for feedback early and often. And whether it's part of a formal onboarding plan or just informally, seek feedback to understand how you're doing transitioning to a new role or a new company, and how you are doing at meeting expectations of important stakeholders. And let me turn it over to you, Cherie, and ask, do you have any other general advice for making transitions?
Sure. So a couple of things. The first, and you and I have talked about this extensively, and that is try not to make any significant decisions within the first 30 days of you joining the organization or transitioning to the new role, no matter how large or small the organization is. And the reason why that is so powerful is because you want to give yourself time to understand where you are, who you are within the organization, how the organization leads, how the organization operates, how you want to lead in that space. So you want to give yourself that time. And that ties into my second point. We have to remember, as new leaders or new people in roles, you have to establish the right to lead and earn the loyalty of the team. Many of us think that we just come on in, we're this big title, and people are just going to accept it and fall in line. And that may not always be the case. So there has to be some time to establish your right to lead and earn the loyalty. And then that sets the stage. And then the final thing, which we've all heard many, many times, but I think it's more important here than ever, you only have one opportunity to make a first impression. So you want to come in prepared. Your onboarding plan, to your point, Michelle, should start before you even start the company on day one. And then you have a clear plan that's communicated the right way, so that you are setting yourself up for success. The whole goal here is so that you can have a successful transition into the organization.
Great, so helpful. Okay, Bob, I want to invite you back in. I welcome you to ask a question if you have one for Cherie or I, but also if you could tell us what the topics are that the audience is interested in. Thanks.
Thanks. So one question that I had is just maybe what are some of the biggest mistakes that you maybe have seen from onboarding, either of you?
Sure. So one mistake that I saw was, and we talked about this, kind of understanding the lay of the land and the culture. I had an individual who did not ask the question about whether any members of the team were sacred cows. And what I mean by that is sometimes you come into an organization and you make a decision about this person should be a part of the team moving forward or not. And you really want to understand the dynamics of the organization. Sometimes that individual, even though they may not be a good fit for you as a new leader, they may have a vested interest in the company. Other business unit leaders may want to keep that individual. That individual may have some critical information or have strong relationships such that if that is disrupted, there needs to be a plan for how that's going to work. So that's why I suggested the 30 days, really sitting back and understanding the lay of the land before significant decisions are made, because that could impact your reputation and your trajectory at the company.
The mistake that I have seen is focusing on one thing over the others. So, for example, if you come into a new role and someone important mentions that they would like you to reorganize the team, it is easy to not build relationships with your business partners that are critical because you overemphasize focusing on the team. If you come into a situation where there's a crisis and someone important on the team mentions that focusing on resolving that crisis is important, you might neglect meeting, inspiring, building a relationship with your team. It's a lot to balance. In-house lawyer jobs are difficult in that you have so many constituents. You don't have one client, so to speak. You have a lot of constituents, internal to your department, external to the company, internal to the company, external to the company. So there are a lot of people that need to be paid attention to. And it's just easy to get sucked into one area. I'm all about the board, or I'm all about the C-suite, or I'm all about my team, and neglect. So Cherie caught me on neglecting, like I wasn't thinking about external customers, and that's another stakeholder set to think about. So there's just, these jobs are complicated. They involve a lot of stakeholders, and it's easy to emphasize one to the detriment of the others. And that's the mistake that I've usually seen. It's not necessarily the same mistake, but it tends to be tilting in one area and not trying to keep any balance.
Well, the one of the questions from the audience is kind of tied into this. It says, as for introductions to stakeholders, it can be overwhelming if there are many. So other than the obvious setting up of meetings, do you have any tricks for getting new in-house counsel around to meet and interact with these stakeholders?
One thing I would mention is Cherie said, maybe there's a trade show coming up that you could go to. Things like that work well, like not necessarily creating meetings for you. I mean, if you're fairly senior and if the relationship is fairly important, I do think you should have a one-to-one personal meeting.
Mhm.
But if you're more junior or if the relationship is not one of the most critical, it can be difficult to create meetings just for the purpose of meeting, but it can be a lot easier to join things. So I would do a lot of asking of what else is taking place, what else is useful from a business perspective, or what else is going on that you might be able to shadow or join or tag along, as opposed to everything having to be created for you. And not all meetings have to be one-to-one, as opposed in some kind of group format. But Cherie, you've done this twice in the last 2 years. So what are your thoughts?
No, I completely agree. I also try to have a week of meetings and then a week off. And during that off week is when I'm trying to sit in on sales meetings, sit in on marketing meetings where I'm not just meeting the person individually, but I'm seeing my team members in action, because that's really where the learning comes in. And I don't have such a great memory, so I would meet people week one and then forget their names and then maybe see them later on. But when I see them in action, and I'm seeing how they interact and where they fit into the organization by attending some of these team meetings, that has been the most fruitful for me. So I have my one-on-ones and then I have a week off and, try to get in, meet with teams, and then I get back to one-on-ones versus overwhelming myself with just nonstop meet and greets.
And that reminds me of one thing I wanted to mention at some point, and this might be a good place, is make a list of questions. And even if you don't know who's going to answer your question, just keep a list of questions. Every time you read something, listen to something, meet someone, anytime something comes up that you don't know, whether it's as simple as an acronym, or it's some financial term that you don't understand, or it's some name you've never heard before, even simple things, just keep a list of questions and then try to figure out who can answer those questions, and even ask people who can answer those questions for you. But it's hard to remember. Cherie was saying, you're going to meet a lot of people. It's harder to keep track of people's names. You'll have questions. It's hard to later remember your questions. And so I would encourage people to keep a list of questions. And then if you're the onboarding leader, what I do when I'm onboarding someone, and Cherie mentioned this, is set up regular meetings. And it really depends on the situation, whether you need to meet every day or every week or every month. It depends on the relationship and the situation, but setting up a regular meeting in parts so that the person feels like they can ask some of their silly questions.
The next question is relative to onboarding within a smaller organization. So is there any recommendations you have, how an onboarding might differ for somebody at a smaller organization, in particular if the person is wearing multiple hats, not just general counsel, they may be heading up human resources, government affairs, something like that.
Yeah, for me.
Well, that could be true. I was going to say that could be true even if you're not at a smaller company. I think Cherie has 6 functional areas of responsibility.
Yes, I do. So I am now responsible for legal, ethics, compliance, government relations, ESG, quality, and regulatory. So coming into the organization, I really had to figure out who is who and what is what. And so I have almost an onboarding plan for each one of those functions. And so it seems like it's a lot, but it really helped me to prioritize, okay, everyone is important, but some are more important than others, and some issues are more pressing than others. And so once I had my task list for each one of the functions that I supported, then I was able to have a kind of broader prioritization. But it was helpful for me to do my prioritization and my onboarding function by function, so I didn't miss something, but I knew I had to go deep with each one of those functions.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm thinking that I've seen as far as mistakes that people make, is sometimes the squeaky wheel gets all the attention, and it's maybe not one of the squeaky things that ends up being a problem later. So trying to just juggle the responsibilities. And I do think it's hard in a smaller company, or a company, no matter what the size, where maybe there's not as many resources and time is so precious. And I think the biggest advice I would have there is just seek feedback, check in with your leader if you're prioritizing appropriately, and also for yourself, block some thinking time. Cherie mentioned Monday mornings, Friday afternoons. Different people have different strategies, but if you are, just running from thing to thing all day, every day, and you can't think, that you're going to miss things, I think.
The next question is regarding, kind of an onboarding situation where the current or existing general counsel or chief legal officers is still there, but they're not particularly friendly. It's kind of they've been asked to leave. Any suggestions or experience in how to deal with that situation?
So for me, I would just highly recommend that there's empathy, right? Putting yourself in that person's shoes. It may not be as easy knowing that their time is up and you're starting fresh. So giving that person the benefit of the doubt, knowing that it's going to end soon, but just trying to be as respectful as possible to that individual. And then, kind of carve things out and try, but before that person leaves, I would personally just try to partner as much as possible, make sure there's a clear transition plan, and then allow that person, as long as they're not being disruptive, just allow them to calmly go into the night, softly go into the night, quietly go into the night, while you, start your new role. But for some people, it can be quite traumatic to still be there when the new person's there, as long as there are boundaries and, making sure that, that the teams, including HR, is aware if this person is being disruptive, but just having a little bit of empathy for that individual who is offboarding, if you will, has been my experience.
I agree with all of that. And I think that Cherie started to touch on this, but I would elaborate even more. Carving out something for the person to do. Having been someone who had to offboard, luckily not because I was fired, but because I retired. But either way, it's awkward. It's awkward if you're the person. It's awkward if you're the person coming in. It's awkward if you're the person going out. Even with the best of situations, well-executed succession plan with a retirement and an internal promotion, which I had the benefit of doing twice, that it's still awkward. It's a difficult situation. So carving out purpose for the person leaving, I think, is really important. And so, sort of mutually agreeing on what value the person can add, even if they're upset or unhappy or not being super helpful, if they at least have some type of purpose, it might be helpful.
The next question is about the comment is, many of these points seem like things you'd like to know before you accept the position. What elements of this approach do you recommend pulling forward to the interview process or post-offer, pre-start?
So for me, I worked my onboarding plan. So I got the physical onboarding plan in many of these instances once I started. But as I've also mentioned, there are a list of materials that I wanted to be able to understand and learn as much as I could about the company prior to starting. And to me, that's probably the most important. You're never going to learn everything. And Michelle knows I've had many, many surprises in both of these companies, which I think is just natural. Not, you can't learn everything, but learn as much as you can through the publicly available information, and even partnering with the HR team. If they're the ones putting together the onboarding plan, they're more than happy to share information in advance. In both cases where I've been the chief legal officer or general counsel, I asked for 2.5-page long lists of information of things that I wanted to see. Now, did I study and memorize everything? No. But I did get the 4 or 5 bankers boxes of materials that gave me a good sense of, okay, these are the sales, these are the customers, this is the go-to-market strategy, these are the, this is how they think of things. Here's some nomenclature, here's some acronyms. And I began to formulate my questions so that when I started, I at least was able to ask questions that clarified things in my mind. You're never going to know everything about the company before you start, but at least it gives you a sense of who the company is and what to expect. The final intangible benefit of that is it also sets the stage for, this person is serious. This person has done their due diligence. This person is on top of things. Now, that may not be the complete case because you have a lot of questions, but at least it helped with my first impression, I believe, I was very serious about the company and I wanted to learn as much as I could about the board, about my peers, about the business, about the team, about the CEO, about, as much as I could about everything, the plants. Mm-hmm. So I think that set the right tone, and that's what I asked for. And they've all been extremely excited to provide that information.
I think you can ask a few due diligence type questions in the interview process, but I think it's hard to do a lot of what we've been talking about. I completely agree with Cherie. Hopefully you're taking a month off between jobs. Hopefully you can spend the last week of that month working on your onboarding and reading and talking to people. But if you're an internal promote, if you don't have any break between jobs, that's not going to be as practical. And I think you have to sell yourself when you're trying to get a job. And depending on the company, they're going to be concerned about confidentiality if you haven't signed anything. So I think some of what we're talking about would be difficult to do in the interview process. But sure, a few of these questions you could ask from a due diligence perspective, I think.
I agree.
Well, we've got some resources that we'd like to share with everyone. And so, Avril, if you can pull up that slide. And so, Michelle, I don't know if there's any.
Yeah, I'll just mention, we put together, I did an article in January of this year with my friend Lloyd Johnson, who's a fellow coach. And we talked about some of the same concepts, not as much about the plan itself and more about onboarding tips, but there's a written article if that would be helpful. And then there's an older article that's, 10 years old, but I still think it's one of the best things written about what to do when you first become a GC by a former general counsel that we have also suggested. I did a webinar with Juliette Pryor, another chief legal officer, earlier this year on preparing to become a general counsel. That might be of interest to some folks on this webinar. And then there's a recent article by one of my fellow coaches at Barker Gilmore, A.B. Cruz, 5 goals to consider setting for your first year as a GC. So, the first article is longer, the last article is quite short. There's a webinar. If you want to listen to another hour in our webinars, you can always watch by video or just listen to as more of a podcast. And then Mark's article, while old, is still good and has a number of checklists that would be helpful to putting an onboarding plan together. So these are just 4 other resources besides this webinar that if you were interested to sign up for the webinar, you might be interested in checking out as well. And when we send along the recording, I believe we will send a link to these resources. And I just want to take a moment to thank Bob for having us both and to thank Cherie for being my partner in this webinar.
Yes, thanks for both of you, sharing some best practices and your experience. And just for everyone that's attending today, we want to make these programs as valuable as possible, and your feedback is important. So we will be sending just a 1-minute survey to all the attendees today. Please provide that feedback. And if anyone has any questions or looking for assistance, whether they're building, developing or optimizing their legal and compliance organization, or you as an individual, contact Michelle or me. And again, thanks for joining today, and we look forward to having you join us on future GC Advantage webinars. Thanks again, everyone.